It is said that there are two things that cannot be avoided in this life, and they are death and taxes. But if you would allow me a little wiggle room, I would suggest to you there's a third. Actually, I think there's more than that, but most definitely there's a third reality that we just, as hard as we might try, we will never avoid it. And the third that I speak of are traps. There's always traps in this life. Guaranteed. You know, the traps that are self-imposed, that we do to ourselves. You know, when we set ourselves up for failure, our expectations or goals that we set out for ourselves are so unreachable, so unattainable that we set ourselves up for a trap to fail. And then there are those other traps set up by others consciously or unconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally, like the trap that Jesus finds himself in today. And that one was certainly intentional. That one was certainly deliberated. That was certainly one that those Pharisees and Herodians had thought about for a long, long time. It's those traps that other people, again, set up for us, asking you and I to do something, to say something, to be something that once we find ourselves there caught in the trap, we realize that we are stuck between a rock and a hard place. We are danged if we do and danged if we don't. Have you ever been there? Go ahead, raise your hands. See, it's true. There's a third thing that we can't avoid. It's those traps. So how did Jesus get himself out of it today? How might you and I get ourselves out of those traps? Well, to begin with, we have to go to today's first reading. Our beloved Cyrus, well, we have to realize that God has a plan to make himself known to the world so that other people might come to know him, and that plan includes all of us. Oh, but you might protest. You might say, Father Steve, that's for you. That's for somebody else. God certainly doesn't have a plan for me to make himself known through me. And I would say to you, yes, he does. How can I be so certain? Well, because he chose Cyrus in today's first reading. Of all unlikely and unthinkable people, Cyrus, who neither knew nor believed in the God of Israel. Imagine that. God's plan is so outrageous, so outlandish, so crazy, that he even chooses people who don't even know him. Cyrus was one of those individuals. So Cyrus in today's first reading was reminded that God was going to use him, of all people, a Gentile, to be able to make God known to the Israelites. Amazing, isn't it, how God's plan works? So the very first thing we have to realize to get ourselves out of traps is that we have to realize that God has a plan for you and I, and that plan is always to make God known, to make God's love known, to make God's forgiveness known, to make God's mercy and compassion known to others. So that's the plan, and we're part of it. So when you find yourself stuck between a rock and a hard place, find and ask yourself, how might I make God known in and through this? Which leads to Jesus in today's gospel. How did he get out of that place, that trap, that being stuck between a rock and a hard place? Because after all, if he would have said, yes, you need to pay the census tax to Caesar, why then Jesus would have what? He would have offended all of his followers, the Israelites, who of course were very angry and against the Roman Empire. And had Jesus said, no, you don't have to pay the census tax, why then he would have provided cause for the Romans to come and get him. He was stuck right smack dab in the middle. But Jesus knew that God had a plan for him to make God known. So how does he do it? Well, he asks for a coin. Isn't God amazing that God could teach us through an object, through a coin? And by asking for the Roman coin, isn't it interesting that the Pharisees and Herodians supply him one when he asks whose image is on it and whose inscription? And by producing a coin out of their pockets, what have they done? They've already accused themselves, because Israelites weren't supposed to carry that Roman coin with them because it had an image of Caesar, who considered himself to be a god. So to have the coin in their pocket would have meant that they were worshiping another god besides the God that they were to make known. Isn't that Jesus clever? Isn't he amazing? So once they produce the coin, Jesus doesn't condemn them for it. That's the beautiful thing. Even when he's fed up and frustrated with the Pharisees and Herodians, even when you and I are fed up with those people who place us in situations where we find ourselves trapped, notice Jesus doesn't give up on them. He simply asks them a question: whose image is this? And whose inscription? And they reply, Caesar. And then he says, well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Notice what Jesus does. He's asking for the image. Whose image is it? Well, it's Caesar's. But then when he says, and then give to God what is God's, well, then all of those Pharisees and Herodians and Israelites would know exactly what that meant, because they knew the Torah in and through every letter of the law. And they would know that that means that they were created in God's image. See the marvel of our Lord? Notice how he moves the Pharisees and the Herodians, and hopefully you and I, from a stance of either or to a stance of both and. Because oftentimes, that's the trap we get ourselves into. We are convinced that it's got to be either this or that. Do we pay the census tax or don't we? And notice what Jesus does. He moves them from an either-or situation and stance to a both-and. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. So if the image of Caesar is on the coin, then give that to Caesar. Where do we find the image of God, my friends? It is right here and here and here, and just point to yourself, here. That's where the image of God is found. So then, give to God what is God's. So we come to this altar, and we receive. But most importantly, we are reminded who we are. So when we find ourselves stuck, when we find ourselves between a rock and a hard place, when we find ourselves wondering, what should I do? Let us remember that God has a plan to be known through you and I, because he has chosen you and I like he chose Cyrus. He has chosen you and I to make him known to the world. Why? Because we are his image. We are his likeness. We are his hope for the world.